The film starts in Texas, where a group of enslaved black people, bound in shackles, are walking through the barren Texas desert while being escorted by the brothers Ace and Dickie. The year was 1858, 2 years before the start of the Civil War. Unfortunately, Django was among the enslaved black population and had been separated from his wife, Broomhilda von Schaft, after being sold away from her. Later that night, their journey is abruptly interrupted by Dr. King Schultz, a German dentist who has turned into a bounty hunter. He stumbles upon them in the dark and approaches them. Ace becomes incensed and demands that Schultz state his purpose or face being shot. Schultz quickly tries to defuse the situation by explaining that he is merely a fellow traveler searching for the slave traders known as the Speck Brothers. In reality, Schultz wants to purchase Django for his knowledge of the three outlaw Brittle brothers and believes that the Speck Brothers have acquired them at a Greenville auction where Django can be found. Schultz then poses a question to the enslaved black people, asking if anyone among them was previously a resident of the Corbucci plantation, so he can buy Django. Once Django speaks up, Schultz brings his kerosene lamp to illuminate the faces of the enslaved black individuals, looking for Django. He then inquires if Django has any knowledge of the Brittle brothers. Django provides their names Big John, Ellis, and Roger, who sometimes went by Little Rog. He then continues to speak about them, explaining that they were overseers at the Corbucci plantation owned by his former owner. However, Schultz interrupts him, informing Django that the Brittle brothers are no longer overseers. He then asks if Django would be able to recognize them if he were to see them again. But their conversation is cut short as Ace suddenly interjects, warning Schultz to stop talking to Django in that manner. Schultz attempts to calm the situation, stating that he is simply a buyer looking to make a transaction. Despite this, Ace refuses to sell Django and eventually trains his gun on Schultz after he declines his order. Schultz mocks Ace by inquiring if he is simply being dramatic or intentionally pointing his weapon at him with malicious intent. With no other option, Schultz quickly shoots Ace in the head and the horse of Dickie after being threatened by Ace. This results in Dickie being trapped underneath the weight of the dead horse. Schultz then approaches Dickie's area and sarcastically apologizes for having shot his horse. However, Schultz didn't want Dickie to take any impulsive actions before he had time to calm down. Despite observing Dickie's frustration, Schultz remains composed and asks him to keep his yelling to a minimum, as he still wants to continue his questioning of Django. Schultz then returns to Django's side to resume their conversation, offering Dickie a fair price after discovering that Django is still able to recognize the Brittle brothers. Sadly, Schultz abandons the other enslaved black people, allowing them to kill Dickie, as Django takes Ace's coat and horse. The next day, Django and Schultz arrive in Daughtry, Texas, attracting the attention of the residents as Django is the first black man they've seen riding a horse. Luck would have it, they quickly become the owners of the bar restaurant as the innkeeper flees upon seeing Django and Schultz enter. Afterward, Schultz reveals his new career choice as a bounty hunter, who earns money by delivering the bodies of escaped slaves to the authorities after they have been killed. Although he is opposed to slavery, he sees an opportunity to make use of the system to his advantage. Schultz needs Django's help to find and kill the Brittle brothers, promising him $75 and his freedom as payment. Despite feeling guilty, Schultz agrees to this arrangement with Django. Later, as they embark on their journey, Schultz learns that Django is married and is on a mission to find and free his wife. Django then tells Schultz that his wife, Broomhilda, was raised by a German and knows some German. She is now serving as a house slave for the von Schafts. As they continue their journey, they stop in Tennessee and find a place to stay, where they plan to infiltrate the plantation by having Django pose as a valet. Schultz then allows Django to choose his desired attire, and they move forward to the plantation to meet Spencer Big Daddy Bennett with the intention of purchasing one of his slaves. Fortunately, Big Daddy agrees to the deal, and Schultz seizes the opportunity to have one of his slaves show Django around the magnificent plantation. During the tour, Django asks Bettina if she has any knowledge of the Brittle brothers, but she answers in the negative. Django, however, suspects that they may be using a different name. Luckily, Bettina mentions the Schaefers who have visited Big Daddy's plantation in recent years. With Bettina's unwitting information, she reveals the location of the three brothers, with Ellis Brittle in the field, and John and Little Raj at the stable, being punished by Little Jody for breaking eggs. Django promptly goes to the stable and kills John, then beats Little Raj after being attacked. After Schultz arrives, Django shoots Little Raj 5 times, and informs Schultz that Ellis is fleeing across the field, causing Schultz to immediately take aim and snipe him. Later in the evening, Big Daddy tries to attack Django and Schultz with a group of men, despite allowing them to leave after they killed the Brittle brothers earlier in the day. Unfortunately, they are unable to convince Big Daddy that the punishment for taking deadly force against a court officer performing his duty would be hanging until death. With no other option, Schultz uses his cart to set up an ambush with explosives and successfully hits the carriage. He then hands over the sniper to Django, who successfully shoots Big Daddy. After the chaos, Django and Schultz spend the night eating and talking, with Django bringing up the topic of his wife. Schultz happily shares what he knows about Broomhilda and entertaining Django. Schultz, feeling a sense of obligation towards Django, informs him that he cannot simply allow him to go to Greenville without proper protection. As a solution, Schultz suggests that Django joins him in the bounty hunting business so that he can earn enough money to buy his wife's freedom. Schultz proposes that Django works with him for the winter season, and in return, he will receive a third of Schultz's bounties. Schultz promises to help Django reach Greenville and find out where his wife was sent by the Germans. The next day, Django and Schultz go back to Texas and start their first job. Django successfully takes down Smitty Bacall and keeps the wanted poster as a keepsake. This leads to his first bounty, and he practices his shooting skills using a snowman. During the winter, the duo accumulates numerous rewards by effortlessly killing multiple suspects. Later, Django and Schultz arrive in Mississippi and witness the numerous enslaved black individuals on the streets. They eventually discover that Broomhilda's new owner is Calvin Candie, who owns the 4th largest cotton plantation in the state, known as Candyland. In their desperation to rescue Broomhilda, Schultz proposes a new plan. Instead of simply buying a horse, they will pose as potential buyers of a farm. Schultz suggests that Django will pose as a wealthy buyer from Dusseldorf and Greenville and use his knowledge of Mandingo fighting to gain access to the fight scene and ultimately, Candyland. Calvin, being the cruel slave owner that he is, forces his slaves to participate in brutal Mandingo fights to the death. Eventually, Django and Schultz encounter Calvin at a gentleman's club where they witness the Mandingo fights, with Django refusing to watch. Schultz takes advantage of the opportunity to approach Calvin and offer $12,000 for one of his best fighters, with the intention of acquiring Broomhilda for a minimal amount, since Calvin is unwilling to sell her. Their plan attracts Calvin's attention, and they receive an invitation to visit Candyland. Later, Schultz informs Calvin that he and Django will be heading to Candyland. Schultz reminds Django not to get caught up in his desire for revenge if he wants to be reunited with his wife. On their way there, they encounter Calvin's slave trackers, who are pursuing a Mandingo fighter named D'Artagnan. The escapee pleads with Calvin not to make him fight anymore, but Calvin orders him to come talk to him properly. Sadly, Calvin finds out that D'Artagnan lost his last fight and publicly shames him by asking if he doesn't understand the concept of reimbursement. Frustrated, Schultz tries to rescue D'Artagnan by offering to reimburse him, but Django steps in and stops Schultz from compromising their cover. Afterwards, Calvin approaches Django and orders him to handle D'Artagnan, resulting in the tracker dogs mauling D'Artagnan to death. Schultz is forced to watch as D'Artagnan is killed. Despite the traumatic event, Django and Schultz continue on to Candyland as if nothing had happened. Stephen is taken aback by the sight of Django riding a horse with Schultz, but Calvin explains that Django is a freeman and instructs his staff to treat them well. Schultz expresses a desire to meet Broomhilda and change her name from Hildy, but when Django hears about the mistreatment she has endured, he is almost tempted to draw his gun. He realizes, however, that he needs to remain calm in order to save his wife. That evening, Django observes a tearful Broomhilda being taken out to clean up. Later, Lara Lee brings Broomhilda to Schultz's room for a talk. Schultz reassures her that he only speaks German so that Calvin's slaves cannot understand them as he reveals their plan to rescue her. He then offers to buy her as his escort while he negotiates the deal during dinner. Broomhilda is puzzled and asks about his friend's identity, leading Django to finally reveal himself to her. During the dinner, Schultz tries to convince Calvin to accept his offer, but his plan is interrupted when Stephen, Calvin's suspicious and loyal head house slave, realizes that Broomhilda knows Django. This leads to Stephen alerting Calvin to the fact that they are not looking to buy a Mandingo fighter, but instead Broomhilda. This puts Schultz and Django's plan in jeopardy. However, Lara Lee comes to the rescue and saves Broomhilda from being mocked by Calvin and Stephen, which also helps Django maintain his composure. As a result, Calvin clears everyone from the dining area and decides to have a private conversation with Django, Schultz, and his lawyer. He then reveals their plan to buy Broomhilda and orders Stephen to bring her out, causing her neck to be hurt in the process. Sadly, Calvin changes the deal at gunpoint and demands $12,000 for Broomhilda instead of the fighter, Eskimo Joe. Although Schultz is reluctant, he agrees to the new price. However, when Calvin threatens to harm Broomhilda with a hammer, Schultz refuses to continue with the deal. In response, Schultz hands over the money right away. After the transaction is completed, they wait for Calvin to provide the necessary paperwork for Broomhilda. However, Schultz has had enough of Calvin's arrogance and shoots him when he hears him demand a handshake as Calvin threatens to continue hurting Broomhilda. So, Butch Pooch quickly reacts by shooting Schultz dead with his rifle, causing Django to go on a shooting spree, taking down Pooch, Calvin's lawyer, and several of Calvin's henchmen. During the gunfight, Django surrenders when he sees Broomhilda being held captive by Stephen and Billy Crash. The next day, Django is subjected to torture by Billy, including almost being castrated, when Stephen suddenly arrives, telling Django that Lara Lee wants to see him. Fortunately, Lara Lee decides against castrating Django and instead decides to sell him to the Luquent Dickey Mining Company. Lara Lee has no choice but to step in for her brother and take control of the plantation. Minutes later, Django is on his way to his new owner, the mining company, where he comes up with a plan to escape. He tries to convince his escorts by claiming that the men on his bounty hunter handbill are at Candyland, promising to share the reward money with them. Fortunately, Django is freed from his escorts after they become convinced of his honesty, with the aid of his fellow enslaved men. He is then given rifles and dynamite by his guards, which he uses to kill them. Django heads back to Candyland with the weapons in hand. He quickly makes his way into the compound and takes out the trackers stationed there, before moving on to the barn to retrieve Broomhilda's freedom papers from Schultz's body. The film concludes with Django bidding farewell to Schultz by tapping his head, determined to avenge him and D'Artagnan, who perished under the jaws of Calvin's slave dogs. Subsequently, he heads straight to the prison where Broomhilda is being held captive. Luck favors Django as he sees this as the perfect chance to rescue Broomhilda, with Calvin's mourners having just returned from his funeral. Later that evening, Django eliminates Lara, Crash, and the remaining henchmen who had just returned from the mansion after paying their respects to Calvin. Once Django has taken his revenge, he orders the two remaining enslaved women to bid farewell to Lara Lee. Meanwhile, Stephen tries to prevent him from leaving. Django takes advantage of the situation and shoots Stephen in the knee, igniting the dynamite that he had previously placed throughout the mansion, ignoring Stephen's cries. After the explosion, Django and Broomhilda watch from a distance as they ride off on horseback together. As a result, Django will henceforth be known as the quickest shooter in the South.